It started with a crisp envelope on the front porch, stamped with the HOA's emblem, and a sense of finality that made my stomach drop. 10 days. That was all they had given us. 10 days to dismantle a shed that had been part of our property for over 20 years. Could a simple notice really override decades of precedent? The thought gnawed at me, and yet the letter left no wiggle room. Non-compliance would trigger fines, liens, and possibly legal escalation. Lakefront living had always felt like a small slice of paradise, with the gentle lapping of waves against the docks and the quiet hum of weekend neighbors. But paradise comes with rules, some reasonable, some petty. And in our neighborhood, those rules were enforced by a committee that had become infamous for pushing residents to the edge of civility. They weren't just enforcing regulations, they were testing boundaries, seeing how far they could push before someone finally snapped. From the start, it wasn't about the shed itself, it was about control. The HOA's argument was that the structures obstructed lake views. But our shed had been there long before many of the current board members even knew this community existed. Decades-old approvals, surveys, even photographs could attest to its legitimacy. And yet, the notice read as if none of that history mattered. The background was as tangled as the overgrown ivy on our lakeside fence. The board, led by a woman the neighborhood quietly referred to as Ms. Karen, had built a reputation on strict rule enforcement and social policing. Meetings that once felt like casual community updates now had the undertone of threats, with every agenda item scrutinized for infractions. Their power came not from charm, but from procedure. Every form, every amendment, every fine calculated to instill fear. Our shed wasn't the first target. Several neighbors had been visited for minor offenses. Garden gnomes out of alignment, mailbox colors that clashed with community standards, boats left docked for more than a weekend. These small disputes snowballed, fueling tension at annual meetings and gossip over backyard fences. A petty streak ran deep, and in our case, the board had set its sights on our property. I spent the first night pacing the living room, the letter trembling in my hand. We were told it needed removal by May 5th. That gave us just 10 days to either demolish or appeal, and the thought of fighting it legally was exhausting. But then came a small detail buried in the HOA's own governing documents. Section 4.03. There was language that, if interpreted correctly, might grant grandfathered status to structures like ours. Evidence of prior approvals, existing surveys, and original board meeting minutes could be leveraged. Suddenly, the tide shifted from despair to strategy. Early the next morning, I gathered the old deeds, photographs, and community records. Dusty folders revealed a timeline showing approvals dating back decades. The shed had not only been there, but had been inspected and accepted multiple times over the years. It was astonishing to see how something so long-standing could suddenly be deemed a violation. Our hearts sank when we realized this was not about adherence to rules, but about asserting dominance over homeowners who dared maintain autonomy. By mid-morning, I had formulated a plan. We wouldn't demolish the shed. Instead, we would build a precise appeal, citing Section 4.03, demonstrating historical approvals, and documenting that no obstruction had been previously flagged. Every photograph, every archived email, every survey would serve as ammunition. The deadline loomed, but knowledge was power. The first call to the HOA office was telling. They were polite but firm, reiterating that the removal order was non-negotiable. Behind the cordial tone, however, I sensed that small spark of superiority that often precedes a Karen neighbor drama. They believed the notice alone would intimidate us into compliance. They underestimated the lengths to which residents can go when cornered. By evening, we began organizing our evidence like soldiers preparing for battle. Floor plans, dated photos of the shed, old inspection approvals, and even aerial shots from local archives, all meticulously cataloged. It was tedious work, but it felt like reclaiming our rights, one document at a time. The air felt heavy with anticipation, the kind that precedes confrontation, and I could already hear the faint hum of neighbors gossiping about the latest HOA nightmare unfolding. Conflict started subtly. A neighbor mentioned they had received a similar notice, yet their shed was newer, and theirs wasn't even near the lake. The board was clearly using arbitrary enforcement to make a point. The tension mounted as residents debated compliance versus resistance. On social media threads dedicated to our community, discussions erupted, with everyone weighing in on HOA versus homeowner dynamics. Some argued for immediate compliance to avoid fines. Others advocated for collective pushback. By day 3, our appeal outline was nearly complete. Section 4.03 provided clear grandfathered language, and historical approvals strengthened our case. But the board, sensing resistance, began ratcheting up pressure. Emails became more insistent, notices more formal, and there was even talk of bringing in an external inspector to verify compliance. The mere thought of a third-party evaluation felt like an invasion. Every doorbell chime sent a shiver down my spine. We started contacting neighbors with similar structures, building a quiet coalition of support. Everyone shared their experiences. Fines issued for minor deviations, letters citing community aesthetics, even threats of liens for delayed payments. Patterns emerged. The HOA was not enforcing rules fairly. They were selectively targeting residents who might push back. It was a textbook HOA revenge story, but one played out on a lakefront stage. One afternoon, as we spread out old board meeting minutes on the dining table, I noticed something peculiar. A certain memo referenced shed approvals in a manner that suggested permanent acceptance, with no sunset clause or expiration date. It was subtle, almost dismissive in tone, but crucial. This was the leverage we needed. Our argument would not just be nostalgic. It would be grounded in written policy, undeniable and procedural. By now, the tension had turned into a low, persistent anxiety. Every neighbor glance felt like scrutiny. Every HOA communique, a potential weapon. And yet, despite the stress, there was a growing sense of strategy, of empowerment. The board's overreach had inadvertently given us the motivation to document, to research, and to prepare a defense that was meticulous. The stage was set for confrontation, and we were ready to escalate, not recklessly, but precisely. The question lingered as we double-checked our citations. Could 10 days really erase decades of approvals? Or would the board's overreach be their undoing? The clock was ticking, May 5th loomed, and the looming fines promised to escalate quickly. The balance of power was shifting. And this, as we entered the second week of the notice, tensions in the neighborhood began to bubble over. Board emails grew increasingly formal, citing vague aesthetic standards, and implying that any delay would trigger a lien. The tone suggested impatience, but also a miscalculation. They assumed we were afraid of a small financial threat. The reality was different. Every notice they sent only strengthened our resolve. We meticulously documented the shed, photographing angles that showcased compliance with original approvals, while also mapping sight lines to demonstrate that no actual obstruction existed. It was painstaking, but the evidence was undeniable. Neighbors began to peek over fences, whispering that our approach might set a precedent, giving voice to a quiet but growing sense of resistance. The looming May 5th deadline hung over us like storm clouds over the lake. The HOA had no idea that we had discovered Section 4.03 and its grandfather protections. If leveraged correctly, it could invalidate their removal order entirely. We began drafting a formal appeal, carefully citing board minutes and photographic evidence. Every word mattered. Every comma could reinforce or undermine our argument. Neighbors with similar sheds reached out, sharing letters and documentation they had collected over the years. Suddenly, our fight felt less isolated. It was a small community revolt waiting to happen. It became clear that the HOA's unilateral approach had awakened a collective vigilance among residents who had previously tolerated petty overreach. By mid-morning, we were reviewing survey records and property maps, noting how previous boards had documented each structure's placement. It was tedious, but absolutely essential. This wasn't just a battle over a shed, it was about autonomy, precedent, and who truly controlled our lakeside paradise. The board escalated the conflict further. A formal letter arrived, threatening a lien if removal didn't occur by May 5th. Their language was precise and cold, designed to instill urgency. Yet, the more they pushed, the more obvious their overreach became. The view's obstructed claim was increasingly shaky, as aerial photographs and property records would soon prove. We began preparing our appeal for submission, laying out a timeline of approvals and inspections that spanned decades. Section 4.03 became our cornerstone. It clearly established that sheds approved prior to certain amendments were exempt from newer aesthetic guidelines. In essence, their own governing document was working in our favor, if we presented it correctly. Our research uncovered subtle evidence in archived board meeting notes. Phrases like "existing sheds shall be considered grandfathered unless explicitly noted otherwise" appeared repeatedly. We highlighted these passages, fully aware that they could dismantle the board's argument if framed carefully. Escalation began in earnest. The HOA sent a second notice, this time with an attached final reminder header and a promise of lien initiation. We could almost hear the smugness behind the language, as if they assumed we would cave. But instead, the letter spurred us to action. The evidence we had gathered was now being organized into a formal package, complete with photographic documentation, historical approvals, and legal references. A local surveyor provided an affidavit confirming that our shed did not violate any current setback rules, and that its placement had long been documented. The HOA had unintentionally given us the tools to strengthen our position while trying to intimidate us. It was the perfect example of a HOA versus homeowner showdown, where patience and preparation could outweigh arbitrary authority. The board's persistence was relentless. Emails, phone calls, and even unscheduled visits occurred, all emphasizing the urgency of compliance. But our appeal package, grounded in Section 4.03 and historic evidence, was nearly ready. The stage was set for confrontation, and for the first time, we felt a sense of satisfaction that we were no longer merely reacting. We were taking the narrative into our hands. By the 18-minute mark of our timeline, the pressure felt palpable. Neighbors whispered warnings, and online forums buzzed with updates about the HOA's increasingly aggressive tactics. We used every scrap of evidence. Final notice dated May 12 from a similar case. CCR Section 4.3 mailbox rule comparisons. Even board agenda excerpts that referenced exemptions for pre-existing structures. The appeal was no longer about simply defending our shed. It was about exposing the HOA's pattern of selective enforcement and petty revenge. But the historical approvals, Section 4.03, and community support formed a strong defense. Their insistence on removal had only rallied us, turning what felt like intimidation into an opportunity for strategic pushback. With May 5th approaching, we began planning our counter-strategy. The appeal would be delivered formally, highlighting every procedural error and historical approval. We anticipated resistance, but were confident that our documentation would hold. More importantly, the HOA had underestimated the collective attention and organization of residents who refused to be bullied. We coordinated with neighbors who had similar structures, sharing evidence and reinforcing arguments that could be applied community-wide. The mood shifted from fear to empowerment. Suddenly, our fight felt like a small but significant rebellion against arbitrary authority. The tension was no longer just about fines. It was about autonomy, fairness, and the precedent that the HOA was attempting to set. Every document, every photograph, every archived note contributed to an appeal that could not be ignored without exposing the committee's overreach. The days ticked closer to May 5th, and the appeal package was finalized. It was precise, meticulous, and compelling. We were ready to confront the board not with anger or emotion, but with evidence and procedure. The countdown had transformed into an organized march toward vindication, but it's only the beginning. With the appeal submitted, the dynamic shifted. For the first time, the HOA had to respond formally, and their previous casual authority was now challenged. The weeks leading up to the scheduled hearing were filled with anxious anticipation. I double-checked every reference, every date, and every photograph, ensuring nothing could be dismissed or misinterpreted. The air was thick with tension, but it was the kind that sparks action rather than fear. Neighbors began discussing the unfolding scenario more openly, exchanging stories of fines gone wrong and HOA ridiculous rules. The committee had inadvertently fostered a network of resistance. Petty revenge HOA scenarios were playing out in real time, and we were at the center, armed with historical approvals and procedural knowledge that even the board couldn't easily contest. The morning of a hearing, I arrived early, carrying folders thick with evidence. The board members entered with a mixture of authority and discomfort. They were encountering organized pushback they had not anticipated. The hearing began with procedural formality, yet the underlying tension was palpable. Every word, every glance, every pause felt weighted with a history of decades-long oversight, now being questioned. We presented our appeal methodically. Photographs of the shed from multiple angles, dated approvals showing long-standing compliance, surveyor affidavits confirming placement, and explicit language from Section 4.03 establishing grandfathered status. The board shifted in their seats, reading carefully, some murmuring in quiet acknowledgement. It was as if the weight of their own governance was pressing back on them. Board members attempted to counter with arguments about obstruction and aesthetic standards, but each claim was met with documented evidence. Their usual authority felt hollow under the weight of procedural correctness. It became evident that their escalation strategy, designed to intimidate, had no footing against the careful compilation of historical approvals. The room carried a tense quiet. Outside, the lake shimmered under afternoon sun, a stark contrast to the brewing storm of civic accountability inside the meeting room. It was satisfying to witness the slow unraveling of their assumption of unquestioned power, their sense of control slipping through procedural cracks. Climax and revenge unfolded in subtle, deliberate fashion. The board was forced to acknowledge the grandfathered status of the shed. Emails circulated later that evening, a formal admission that removal was not required, with instructions that all fines related to this issue would be nullified. Months of anxiety, preparation, and strategic documentation had culminated in this procedural victory. It was quiet revenge, but deeply satisfying. The HOA had attempted a power play, using arbitrary deadlines and threats of liens, but careful research, historical documentation, and a clear understanding of governance had neutralized their aggression. The message was unmistakable. Homeowners could defend their rights without resorting to confrontation beyond procedure and evidence. There was a moment of reflection as we packed up the evidence. Every folder, every photograph, and every document had served as a shield and a sword. The HOA, once a looming authority, had been reminded that accountability and transparency are not optional. Our shed stood as a symbol, not just of personal property, but of standing firm against bureaucratic overreach. The neighborhood's response was gratifying. Whispers of HOA versus Karen scenarios circulated online, and other residents began reviewing their own compliance histories. The case had become an informal guide for resisting petty enforcement, and it was encouraging to see a sense of empowerment ripple through the community. Aftermath was calmer than expected. The sheds remained, fines were reversed, and a subtle shift occurred in HOA meetings. A new awareness lingered in the air. Overreach could be challenged, and procedure mattered more than posturing. Our family felt both relief and vindication, understanding that persistence, preparation, and strategy had triumphed over intimidation. Tell me your HOA horror in one line. Did you stand your ground or fold under pressure? Next video tease. In the coming story, a cul-de-sac feud escalates over a mailbox color, revealing secrets, alliances, and petty revenge that the HOA never saw coming. Stay tuned as neighbors clash in a battle of aesthetics and authority, and one small act triggers a community-wide uproar.